Hello, everyone. I wanted to give you a quick little video into a sneak peek of your book that's coming up for you to be reading. It's going to be in your OLS, and it's called Hidden Figures, a Young Reader's edition. And it's the New York Times bestselling author, Margot Lee Shetterly. So let's go ahead and we're going to watch a video first, a little sneak peek into your Hidden Figures book. Let me get it ready for you. All right. All right, so that's a little sneak peek into your Hidden Figures book. Let's go back to our file. Hidden Figures, that was your sneak peek into it. Words you'll need to know for your Hidden Figures OLS lessons. You'll need to know about pioneer, which is one who does something first, a leader. The next one is remote. That means it's far away or distant. Efficient means effective, performing in the best way possible. And subtle means indirect or understated. So those are your vocabulary words for Hidden Figures. Okay, so we didn't get a chance to do this in class today. But remember when we talked about when authors sit down and they decide what kind of book they want to write, and they also give a purpose. They also want you to learn something, or there's something very important that you need to be learning while you're reading this book. So Hidden Figures is a work of nonfiction. Okay, so it's about real women that lived back in the 50s and 60s that helped out NASA and other forms of the space program. So it says Hidden Figures is a work of nonfiction. What is the most important purpose for reading this text? Is it first one, to learn how to do something? The second one, to be convinced to agree with the other, or to learn about real life events, or to be thrilled by a story set in the past? So which one do you think Hidden Figures is? Is it the first one, second one, third one, or fourth one? So look at it a little closer. What do you think the purpose is for reading the text that's called Hidden Figures? What do you think the purpose is? What was the purpose that the author wanted you to learn? What do you think? Well, let's take each one. This says, what is the most important purpose for reading the text Hidden Figures? Do you think it's learned? Do you think they're going to teach you to learn something? No, it's not going to teach you anything to learn. To be convinced to agree with the author? No, it's not a persuasion. It's not a persuasion. The next one, C, to learn about real life events? Yes. Or last, to be thrilled by a story set in the past? Well, for our purposes, it's to learn about real life events and what these women did. So when you're reading, make sure you understand what you think the author's purpose. Establish a purpose for reading. And you are definitely going to be learning about real life events in Hidden Figures. Okay, so what's a prologue? Well, prologue is something that's at the very, very beginning of a book. And it says it's a piece of writing before the first chapter that gives us information separate from the main story. So that's called a prologue. So read the title yourself, Prologue, and then go down here and read what it is. Read to yourself. Okay. Chapter 1, setting the scene. All right, let me get you the prologue first. It is, like I said, it's the prologue is the part that's before the first chapter. It's a piece of writing before the first chapter that gives us information separate from the main story. So let me get that for you. Let's get the prologue ready for you. I had all these ready, but they disappeared on me. This is called a prologue for Hidden Figures. It's the part that goes before. It's the part before the first chapter, prologue. Okay, let me share my screen with you. All right, prologue, Hidden Figures. Pop shelf. I love pop shelf.
Hidden Figures, Young Readers Edition by Margot Lee Shetterly. Prologue. Growing up in Hampton, Virginia, I assumed the face of science was brown like mine. My dad worked at the Langley Research Center at NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He started there as an engineering intern in 1964 and retired as an internationally respected climate scientist in 2004. Our next-door neighbor taught physics. Our church pews were crowded with mathematicians. I knew so many African Americans working in science, math, and engineering that I thought that's just what Black folks did. My father, who was a high school student, had wanted to study electrical engineering, lived a different story. Become a physical education teacher, my grandfather told him. He thought my dad would have trouble finding work as an engineer. In the 1960s, most college-educated African Americans took teaching jobs or worked for the post office. As late as 1970, just 1% of all American engineers were Black, and my father was one of them. Because of my father's job, I was part of the NASA family. I grew up saving my allowance to buy tickets to ride ponies at the annual NASA Carnival and sharing my Christmas wish list with the Santa at the NASA holiday party. On Thursday nights, I sat with my family and cheered for the Stars, my dad's NBA team. That's the NASA Basketball Association. My Sunday school teacher worked at NASA as a computer, doing the complex math for the aerospace engineers. She wasn't alone. From the 1940s through the 1970s, hundreds of women, many of whom were Black, worked as mathematicians at NASA. It wasn't until I was older that I appreciated just how extraordinary this occupation was for Black women in the South during the days of segregation. The first 5 women were hired at Langley as computers in 1935, and they were white. 10 years later, there were more than 400 women working as mathematicians, and many of them were Black. The contributions made by these African American women have never been heralded, but they deserve to be remembered, and not as a side note in someone else's account, but as the center of their own story. These women should be celebrated not just because they are Black or because they are women, but because they are an important part of American history. This is their story.
Awesome. All right, now let's go to chapter 1.
Chapter 1, setting the scene. Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden loved math. As children, they showed special skill in arithmetic, and then they went on to study mathematics in college. After graduation, they worked as teachers before going to work as computers or mathematicians for the government's Air and Space program. Over the years, hundreds of women worked as mathematicians for the federal agency called the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which researched and promoted the study of flight. But these women were among many who distinguished themselves with their talents and hard work. Dorothy Vaughan was a pioneer. She joined the NACA in 1943, the first year the agency began hiring African American women as computers, and she was the first to be promoted into a management position. She was a role model for other women, and she helped to steer the careers of many talented women who were joining the NACA. Mary Jackson was the first African American woman to move up the ranks and become an engineer at the NACA. She was a fighter, standing up for herself and for other women who deserved the chance to prove themselves. Her work helped to make supersonic aircraft fly higher and faster. Katherine Johnson was an African American woman who became an essential member of the team that put the first American in orbit around Earth. She was a dreamer and an independent thinker who was unafraid to imagine what others considered to be impossible. She helped do the math that was required to send the first men into space and to bring them home safely. Christine Darden was an African-American woman who became one of the world's leading experts on supersonic flight. She became the face of the next generation of female space scientists. Her groundbreaking research on predicting sonic booms is still used today. The accomplishments of these four women were remarkable, but their work was even more impressive because it was achieved while living and working in the South during a time when racial discrimination was commonplace and when most women with an interest in math were expected to become math teachers. A different time. In the 1800s, after the Civil War, the government passed laws that ended slavery and granted full citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Later, however, many state and local governments passed other laws that legalized racial segregation. These regulations were the most common in the South, kept Black people and white people apart in many situations. They could not eat in the same restaurants. They could not drink water from the same water fountains. They could not use the same restrooms. They could not attend the same schools. They could not ride in the same parts of buses. They could not live in the same neighborhoods. They could not receive care in the same hospitals. They could not visit the same beaches. They could not compete on the same sports teams. They could not sit in the same sections in movie theaters. They could not marry someone of a different race. They could not even be buried in the same cemeteries. Technically, African Americans had the right to vote. However, many local laws made it impossible for them to do so. Some communities levied or charged poll taxes, or enforced literacy requirements, or imposed other restrictions that made it difficult or impossible for Black people to register and vote. And since people who were not registered to vote weren't allowed to serve on juries or run for political office, many African Americans were deprived of these civil rights as well. During the 1930s, the United States experienced the Great Depression, a decade-long period of economic struggle. Jobs became difficult to find and wages decreased dramatically. All Americans suffered, but African Americans faced the most serious challenges in finding work. For many African Americans, World War II was an opportunity to make a better life for themselves and their families. Black men enlisted in the military in large numbers, even though they served in separate Black infantry regiments, usually overseen by white officers. They believed that their loyalty and patriotism would help Blacks to earn rights that white citizens had. Women also enlisted in the Army, where they were called WACs for Women Army Corps. And they served in all-female units in the Navy too. And for women like Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden, World War II opened the door to a career as a professional mathematician. Each of them found their way to the Langley Laboratory, where they met one another. And women like them, smart, brave, confident, and good at math. The war was changing the world, and it would change their lives as well.
Let's race.
Hang on, let's go to chapter 2. All right, now we're going to do
Time
chapter
to
2.
switch to Spectrum Mobile, the nation's fastest growing mobile provider. Now, when you buy a Spectrum
Hold on,
Mobile
we gotta go
unlimited
through the
line for
ad.
just $29.99, you get another unlimited line free for 12 months.
So stay with
Switch
us. We're
to
going to do chapter
Spectrum
2
Mobile.
next.
Ghirardelli Intense Dark. Bold. Rich.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2, A Door Opens. The newspaper ad caught the attention of many women. It read, "Reduce your household duties. Women who are not afraid to roll up their sleeves and do jobs previously filled by men should call the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory." A few years earlier, an ad like this would have been unthinkable. Most employers never would have considered a woman for a job that had always been performed by a man. But in the spring of 1943, with World War II in full swing and many men off serving in the military, the country needed all the help it could get. Employers were beginning to hire women to do the jobs that had once belonged only to men. This particular ad was placed by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, a government agency dedicated to studying the science of flying. The NACA shared a campus with the U.S. Army Air Corps in Hampton, Virginia, a city in the southeastern part of the state next to the Chesapeake Bay. The NACA's mission was important and unique to help the United States develop the most powerful and efficient airplanes in the world. Airplanes moved military troops, tracked enemies, and launched bombs. World leaders felt that the country that ruled the skies would win the war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt believed in the importance of air power, so 2 years earlier, in 1941, he had challenged the nation to increase its production of airplanes to 50,000 units a year. At that time, the industry had manufactured only 3,000 planes a year. The NACA and private industry were up for the challenge. By 1943, the American aircraft industry was the largest, most productive, and most sophisticated in the world, making 3 times more planes than the Germans, who were fighting on the other side of the war. Victory through air power. Before manufacturers built the airplanes, the designs were developed, tested, and refined at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, which was where the NACA had first begun its operations in 1917. The engineers created wind tunnels to simulate, or imitate, different conditions a plane could encounter when flying. This helped the engineers to test airplane parts as well as whole aircraft, examining them for any problems like air disturbance and even uneven wing geometry. After that testing, pilots flew the planes trying to assess how the machines handled in the air. Did the aircraft roll unexpectedly? Did it stall? Was it hard to guide or maneuver? Making small changes to the design added up to a difference in performance. Even tiny improvements in speed and efficiency multiplied over millions of pilot miles added to a difference that could tip the balance of the war. People looking at Langley knew that they were doing their part to win the war. Victory through air power, said Henry Reed, the engineer in charge of the Langley Laboratory, and the workers took their mission to heart. Wanted, female mathematicians. Each of the engineers at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory required the support of a number of other workers, craftsmen to build the airplane models, mechanics to maintain the test tunnels, and number crunchers to process the data that was collected during the tests. For the engineers, a plane was basically a complex physics experiment. Physics is the science of matter, energy, and motion. Physics meant math, and math meant mathematicians. At the Langley Laboratory, mathematicians meant women. Female mathematicians had been on the job at Langley since 1935, and it didn't take long for the women to show that they were just as good or even better at computing than many of the male engineers. But few of the women were granted the title mathematician, which would have put them on equal footing with some male employees. Instead, they were classified as sub-professionals. A title meant that they could be paid less. At Langley, the female mathematicians were called computers. They did the computations to turn the results of the raw data gathered by the engineers into a more useful form. Today, we think of computers as machines, but in the 1940s, a computer was just someone whose job it was to do computations, a flesh and blood woman who was very good with numbers. In 1943, it was difficult for the Langley Laboratory to find as many qualified women as they needed. A recruiter from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics visited colleges in search of young women with analytical or mathematical skills. The human computers. When the managers couldn't satisfy the demand with only white employees, the government decided to hire African Americans. A civil rights leader named A. Philip Randolph encouraged President Roosevelt to sign an executive order, a law that ordered the desegregation of the federal government and defense industry and created the Fair Employment Practices Committee. This executive order opened up new and exciting opportunities for African Americans, allowing them to work side by side with white people during the war. The federal government also helped create special training classes at black colleges, where people could learn the skills they would need to be successful in the war jobs. Black newspapers like the Norfolk Journal and Guide published articles telling their readers to apply for these new job openings, and there were many applicants. The applications were not supposed to consider race. A recent law had done away with the requirement that the application must include a photo. but it wasn't hard for employers to figure out which job candidates were Black. African Americans did not have access to white colleges and universities. So Black applicants came from Black colleges, such as West Virginia State University, Howard University, Hampton Institute, and Arkansas Agricultural, Mechanical, and Normal College. Many of the African American candidates had years of teaching experience as well as math and science degrees. Once hired, the Black mathematicians were assigned to a separate workspace in the warehouse building on the west side of the Langley campus. The East area computers were all white. The West area computers were all Black, except for the supervisor and her assistant, who were white women. There had always been African American employees at Langley, but they had worked as janitors, cafeteria workers, mechanics assistants, and groundskeepers. Hiring Black mathematicians, that was something new. For the most part, the engineers welcomed extra hands, even if those hands were Black. The Langley Laboratory was operating around the clock to test airplanes to be flown by American soldiers in the war. Everyone had a job to do. Hampton, Virginia, where the Langley campus was located, was very much a Southern town. State law and Virginia custom meant that African Americans did not ride the same buses, or eat in the same cafeteria, or use the same bathrooms as whites. The Langley staff had to prepare for the arrival of the African American mathematicians. One of the tasks, creating metal bathroom signs that read "Colored Girls." For the Black women, the experience of working at a laboratory offered the chance to do interesting work that would help support the war effort. Walking into an unfamiliar environment wasn't easy for the women of the new West Area Computing Office, but each of them was eager for the opportunity to help their country and prove that they too could be excellent mathematicians.
Okay, that was the prologue, the chapter 1, chapter 2. Let's go back to our file and see what you need to do next. It says, next steps, go complete all your OLS lessons that have today's date. Retake any unmastered assignments and email your teacher if you need help. Thank you guys for being good listeners, and I'm hoping you will enjoy your hidden figures, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, everyone.